Have you been doing any hiking?
Yes, so we actually last Sunday, we took Saturday afternoon, we took a big old chicken, it's called a Pinzgauer. It's actually native for the Swiss Army. I don't know how it ever got to the but somebody from our Swiss community saw it and saved water. And these things crawl up the hill like nothing else. It's Pinzgauer. So you can actually, they have one, the red one, where you can sort of sit in the back. And he's loaded with wood as much as we can. And we broke it out of the mine because there was no wood there anymore. You can. Well, I mean, it's a different ride. It's, I mean, you have to, you can block the directions. So, and then when you completely block it, essentially you can't steer it. Because but then no wheel can steer it. I mean, it can slip, but it doesn't make it, one slips, it doesn't make the others stop. And so that's how we constantly, so we have three blockages. You can block in the front or the back, and block at this direction. So you're constantly. And then it goes to the turns of no, you can't actually. There's a gate and you need the code to go through the gate. So this was at night. So this was just before I could go. This is the hut here, and here's the car. It was unloaded. We had somebody who came up and measured out of the roof. So here it is. Here's what here's all. We had two had to sit in the back, so we filled it with wood, and it was just crawling on. And it was awesome. This is still the road is still good, so we were squeezed in the back. It was so good.
Too close? Well, friends, let's begin. Come on down. I think so. Small group today. Oh, there's Jackie. No questions. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. And a special greetings to everyone online, whenever you might watch this or wherever you might be. We fixed the audio so you can now hear us online, both this class and service. So grateful for that. Today we're going to be looking at 4 foundational theologians that shaped a significant understanding of our spiritual journey today, the modern understanding of our spiritual journey. And but just for those who are just joining us for the first time today, just a little review. We started out on August 11th looking at the foundational biblical scriptures or biblical themes that have influenced the consciousness of how we understand the spiritual journey. Passages like Moses going into the wilderness for 40 years, wandering, the burning bush, and many other stories that have shaped our consciousness of understanding the spiritual journey. For better or for worse, those stories in the Bible are there, the Old and the New Testaments. And August 18th, we continued with that, exploring more biblical themes. August 25th, last Sunday, we looked at early Christian themes and influence of Neoplatonism, martyrdom, the theme of martyrdom, giving yourself up to gain God or gain heaven. This idea that this earth was not the real. What was real is heaven. It's a very Platonic idea. And then we looked at the brides of the monasteries, the first monks who went to the wilderness. So today we'll be looking at foundational Christian theologians, and I have a handout. Today we'll be looking at Gregory of Nyssa, Evagrius Ponticus, St. Augustine of Hippo, and Dionysius, or Pseudo-Dionysius, or simply Denis. Has anyone ever heard of any of those four theologians? One. Let me guess. St. Augustine? You've heard of Pseudo-Dionysius. Awesome. Not many Christians know about Pseudo-Dionysius. Oh, that's true. That's true. Which one? Did you get the origins of the mystical tradition? Origins? Yeah. Or love burning in the soul. Anyway, it's okay. So I have all the books, well, the four big books that each of these have written. So first, Gregory. Okay, yeah. Gregory of Nyssa. Cool. Oh, I know which one you're talking about. Yeah. So this is Gregory of Nyssa, The Life of Moses. This is a famous book. It's a part of the Classics of Western Spirituality series, and you can get all these mystics online on Amazon. It's very wonderful. You can see how influential his thought was, but also how archaic some of it is, too, how old-fashioned. Then Evagrius, who is one of the first monks, desert monks, who systematized quite a bit of theology for the lifestyle of living in the wilderness, seeking God. And he came up with, he was the first to really systematize what we now call the seven deadly sins. He called them the thoughts, or the logico, the thoughts that people have. Then St. Augustine, his Confessions, classic book if you've not read it. And then, which is the next one? Oh, Pseudo-Dionysius. So this is most of Pseudo-Dionysius' primary writings that we have left. A selection of them, also from that series, Classics of Western Spirituality. So you can get the actual text that these people have written in this order pretty easily. So let's begin with this quote, and we'll use it as our prayer. This is from St. Augustine, his Confessions. I believe this is book 9 in his Confessions. O truth, who are eternity, and love, who art truth, and eternity, who art love, thou art my God. Amen. St. Augustine, perhaps out of all of these, was the most influential on Western Christianity theologically. But one of the things that kind of dropped out of influence was his emphasis on contemplation and mysticism. He has quite a bit of it in his Confessions, but you have to kind of go hunting for it. But we'll get to St. Augustine in just a minute. So let's begin with Gregory of Nyssa. You can see his dates there. He was born in 335. So if you remember from last week, historically speaking, that's 10 years after what happened? The Constantine the emperor defeated his rival generals, and he made Christianity the official religion of Rome, or at least it became the favored religion. So all of a sudden, Christianity overnight went from being a political uprising of the people to being the chosen, favored religion of the empire, and they came into quite a bit of money. So he's born in what is now known as the era of the Christian Empire. The Roman Empire absorbing Christianity. It would reach a climax in the Holy Roman Empire about 1,000 years later, a little less than 1,000 years later. But you can see that he's one of the first influential theologians that affected the empire. And what you just said, Don, is accurate, because Gregory of Nyssa was one of the most influential theologians to shape the thinking of the Council of Nicaea, the first council of the church, where they kind of worked out some of the ideas of the Trinity. Okay, so you can see his context there, and he's quite early, but he is a major bridge from the more speculative early spiritual writings of Origen and Clement of Alexandria that we considered last week. And now we see Christianity really getting its chops theologically, for better or for worse. He is one of the most influential theologians and one of the most profound and beautiful theologians. He is highly shaped by Platonism, and you can see that in his primary writings, Commentary on the Song of Songs and Life of Moses, both of which he spiritualizes those passages from the book of Song of Solomon, and he spiritualizes Moses' life, and he uses that as a template for the spiritual journey in general. He draws conclusions. But he's interpreting the passage in the classic Platonic way. The word is allegorically, not literally. And that was one of the most important tools that the early theologians gave to the Christian church that was lost in the Reformation, for better or for worse, was the allegorical interpretation of Scripture versus the literal. So, for example, in the life of Moses, they don't really care about the historical critical method of who wrote this and if it actually happened. I mean, they assume that it wasn't exactly literal, perhaps, or even historical. The most important thing was that how you interpreted this spiritually, how you applied it to your own spiritual journey. So in the case of Life of Moses, you'll see here in just a moment, Moses' ascent to the top of the mountain where he received the law and had a conversation with God in the cloud of darkness encircled Moses. And he used this as a spiritual theme to talk about our spiritual journeys, everyone's spiritual journey, not just Moses. So the allegorical interpretation of Scripture enabled them to move beyond just the historical or literal level and to talk at the spiritual level, which is so influential to people's own spiritual journeys, how we understand our spiritual journey today. He was the first to use, as far as we know, to use the image of the spiritual ascent in his spiritual writings. Where did he get that from? It was very Platonic, and he had been influenced by Platonism, the idea of ascending back to the alone, the flight of the alone, back to the alone. He was very Platonic, but he got it right from Moses' journey of the ascent up to the mountain to encounter God. But this idea of the spiritual ascent became very influential in the ensuing 1,500 years of Christianity, to the point where, and next week we'll talk about the cloud of unknowing and other famous authors like Meister Eckhart, who drew upon this idea of the ascent, that the more real and the more true and the more spiritual is higher. So it's very interesting. Pseudo-Dionysius, however, goes the opposite direction. He goes down into the depths, into the darkness, into the unknowing of God. Similar themes that resonate, but they're different ideas on the spectrum. So Gregory of Nyssa was first to use the image of the ascent. He believed in the detachment from the physical to gain spiritual illumination, and one of his major themes was on virginity. He wrote a big book on virginity. So if you've ever wondered, why did the Catholic priests, why did these priests, where did this idea of virginity come from, or chastity for the monks come from? Well, to a little extent, it comes from Jesus, who makes this statement, whoever leaves mother and father, I guess wife and children, for the sake of the kingdom of God, will get all that more back in heaven. He kind of hints at that. Then he also says something like, there are some who become eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven, which suggests that they make themselves eunuchs. So you have it in Jesus teaching these hints, but you can interpret those passages in different ways. But with the whole Platonic mindset that the spiritual is better, the intellectual is better than the physical, the downplay of the physical body, like Origen last week castrating himself to gain God and to gain that mind that can seek after God, really was influential in the next emergence of of Christianity into the Middle Ages, this detachment from the body. Go to the monastery, don't have sex, don't get married, don't have children, just give yourself completely to God and be a spouse of God. Marry Christ. It made sense for the women to betroth to Christ, but for men it was a little different. They still had devotional love songs to God, but it was less specific. But nevertheless, they gave up their sexuality to pursue God, which isn't actually a bad idea or a unique idea in the field of spirituality. Even in specifically Hinduism and Buddhism, there's a emphasis on the control of the lower energies, the lower chakras, which are very powerful. It's easier to talk about culturally and more, in good, polite company. Presbyterians talk about the belly energy, what the Japanese call the hara energy, which is the Japanese view this as the center of the being. We talk about this in terms of eating or gluttony or food, so we can talk about the energy of food energy pretty easily in polite company. You go down a level in the chakras, the Muladhara chakra, the sex chakra, and people are uncomfortable talking about it. That's where Evagrius, and we'll get to him in just a moment, was so useful, because he applied some of this wisdom in terms of the thoughts, the daily thought of lust, and made it more accessible to talk about because it was an intellectual thing, less than a physical thing. But what I'm trying to say is that this theme of that the body is bad or to be controlled or diminished is universal in a great amount of different spiritual traditions, especially Hinduism and Buddhism, who really mastered, especially in Zen Buddhism, mastered the art form and the practices of helping people master themselves. There's an analogy, Plato used this, but it's also in Buddhism, that the body is the chariot, and the mind is the driver, and the heart, or the emotional center, is the horse, the will. So a lot of people are disconnected. They've got a cart going this way, their body. They've got emotions, horses going this way, and the driver's in the pub drunk, not paying attention. Anyway, so integration is the key for the goal here spiritually on our journeys, but a lot of people took rabbit trails de-emphasizing the body in negative, harmful ways, like castrating yourself or fasting to such an extent that you're emaciated, or in just in general living as if the physical dimension's evil and bad. And there was a whole line of thinking along those ideas called asceticism, and even the Gnostics, many of the Gnostics. When you want to find out if someone is a Gnostic, a true Gnostic, versus a Christian, because there's a lot of similarities, just ask them, is the body good? Is the body created by God and good? And a true Gnostic will say, no, the body is evil, it's fallen. But Christians will say, no, we're created in the image of God, the body is good. So a little bit of a difference there. Soul is created by God for Gregory of Nicaea, but it is not divine. And this is where he starts to mature Christian thinking away from that Platonism. Origen and Clement of Alexandria were so enamored by the Platonist thinking, especially through the Neoplatonists, their influences of Philo especially, and Plotinus, who were modern day people to Origen and Clement. They were so enamored with their ideas that you couldn't quite tell where their Christianity ended and their Platonism began. And some theologian, historian said, when the early Christians think, they Platonize. But now with Gregory of Nyssa, we see him differentiating himself from Platonism significantly. And this is important because he basically says, yes, the soul is created by God, and he's the first to say this in the spiritual tradition of Christianity, but the soul is not divine. And that's a very significant differentiation from Platonism, which says the soul is a spark from the fire of God, is divine. And same thing with Hinduism. They say the Atman is Brahman, the soul is God. Atman, soul, or beingness, is Brahman, God. And that idea is rampant today in what we would just call, modern Western spirituality or New Age thinking. It's so influenced by this idea that human beings are just a spark from the divine, or a drop of water from the ocean of God's divinity. Well, he said the soul is created by God, but it is not divine. And here's one of the things that he's famous for, which makes him more Christian than Platonist. He said the soul cannot know God directly. The soul cannot know God directly. And so this becomes a theme throughout the unfolding of Christianity, that you need a mediator to know God. And for him, it was Christ. Christ was the incarnation of God in physical form that made knowing God possible, and that we could know God more and more and more through our life by way of these three stages. Now, you'll notice this theme of three stages that Plato talked about, the three stages where a lot of this comes from, that ends in a kind of, he called it henosis, or oneness with God, by way of seeing or contemplating the real. So here we see Gregory of Nyssa developing three stages. He called it light, cloud, and darkness. So you began by being enlightened by truth, which came through the scriptures and hearing good teaching. That was the image of light. Light shines in our minds, and we are enlightened by truth. Then there's this phase of groping, and they can be simultaneous too. These phases can overlap. A phase of groping or seeking out, which later would be called purgation. And then he called this, the last phase, the darkness, or entering into the chamber of divine darkness, where you see in a different way. You close your eyes and you see with the inner eye. It's a cave of unknowing, but it's also a cave of revelation where you experience things. And what he's trying to describe here is the normal human experience of going within. When we go within in meditation, there is a sense of tuning out from the senses of the external world, and the lights go on in a different way, even though you're in the darkness. But he's hinting at this as the importance of faith. Let me see if I can read to you a little bit here of what he means by this. Regarding the last entering into the divine chamber. The last phase, or darkness, comes when the soul has progressed to the secret chamber of divine darkness. Notice the language. The soul has progressed. That's the spiritual journey right there. So it presupposes that there's something more than just having information or having truth or revelation. There's something more here, deeper, that one can enter into the secret chamber. The secret, that's very interesting. It's very Gnostic. The secret chamber of divine darkness. Jesus never talked like that. He did say, don't tell anyone what I'm telling you, but then he let it all out. But he was not a secret keeper as far as the Gospels are concerned. But here we see this secret chamber of divine darkness, and with sense perception, sight and sound, and reason now irrelevant. Can you imagine John Calvin saying your mind was irrelevant? He would never have said that. But it can now contemplate the divine mystery. With your senses down and your intellect offline, you can now contemplate the divine mystery. The true vision, he says, and the true knowledge of what we seek consists precisely in not seeing, in an awareness that our goal transcends all knowledge and is everywhere cut off from us by the darkness of incomprehensibility. So this is a very unique aspect. He's trying to basically say the way forward is not this Gnostic emphasis on secret knowledge. You can't know really anything. It's all by this inner seeing, this inner faith, which is a wonderful thing to regain in our era. And really this is coming back, and it's called apophatic, the apophatic way, the way of unknowing. Apo, without, phatic, seeing, without knowing. So let's see. This is what I want to say. Gregory's described the soul's ascent, quote, as an ascent to God as a never-ending journey. A never-ending journey. The soul's ascent to God as a never-ending journey. So you never get there. This is very interesting. It's a never-ending journey, a correlative to the fact that God itself is boundless. And he invented a word, a Greek word, and he called it epikatesis, like ecstasy, but it's a little different than ecstasy. It literally means out from oneself. This constant groping would be a good word for it. This constant movement out of oneself toward the future. You'll never get there, though. You never get to God because God's moving too. God's boundless. So this reaching out for God is fulfilled, he says, only with a further desire to reach him. So there's really no promise that you'll get there, but the only way to get there is to keep getting there, to keep groping after God. So that's the journey from his perspective, is that it's a never-ending journey of seeking, of groping. And if you do encounter God, if you do have an experience, it's only by God's grace that has made possible, like God meeting Moses on the mountain. So it's like after enjoying the groping of climbing to the top of a hill, he says, we then see there is a higher peak beyond, which inspires us to continue our journey. And I don't know about you, but I've been hiking like you all, and you see that's the peak right there, and then you get there and you realize it was a false peak, and behind it, because of the perspective, is the real peak, and you're like, shit, I can't keep going on anymore. And he says this goes on infinitely. So it's a really beautiful emphasis.
He said, he said that he really influenced the Council of Nicaea.
Yes.
So when I think of the Council of Nicaea,
Here, you can use the
I don't know whether this is true or not, okay. But when I think of the Council of Nicaea, I think it sort of put a lot of emphasis on the beliefs rather than on the experiencing. But what you describe here is still experiencing.
Yeah, he was all about experience.
So how is this, and I mean, I think the Council of Nicaea, so you have to believe, correct? I mean, I don't know if it's true.
I look at it differently. I think the whole reason for, I don't think Constantine necessarily was a Christian. Maybe his mother was. I think, that's what they say. He got converted on his deathbed. All right. I think he was fighting his brothers, and I think he was trying to establish an empire. And I think I don't know if he made it up, but he saw in the clouds a cross, and all of a sudden he was a Christian. Okay. But I think there were maybe over 100 different sects and religions that could have been chosen at the Nicees at the time, historically. I think he realized that if he was going to solidify after probably killing his brothers and taking control and stuff, he could see the power of an empirical religion. Now, I don't think he understood it that well. But I think he realized that the Gnostics were intellectually approaching it, and were arrogant a little bit. So I think he got rid of about half of all the Gospels. I think they picked and chose Gospels that if it interfered with the empire going forward, I think they didn't do it. Like the one of Mary Magdalene or Jane. Some of them that we now recognize aren't, the deal. So I think you have to look at it fairly practically, because I think they were meeting at a real swanky resort on the weekend. No, seriously, they were. They brought in all the bishops from all the different places, and he wanted to have control, and he recognized that he could have a sub-control of an empire through religion, and I think that's what the Nicees was more about, and I think they lost stuff and they gained stuff. Another thing I think they were after is, listen, I believe that the priest, at least in Rome, maybe not the mothers in the desert, but the priests in Rome were women, because women did the Eucharist in the catacombs, And I think a woman set up the meal each time, and a woman did what we consider the Eucharist. And I think he was also trying to go to a patriarchic society as opposed to a matriarch. Why? Because a lot of what they had to do, and it developed later even more so, they had a lot of goddesses. And that was conflicting with where they wanted to go. So I think you have to look at that as opposed to it from a necessarily philosophical point of view.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So that's good background. You know your history there. So, but you know the emphasis of Gregory of Nyssa, of Nyssa, N-Y-S-S-A. He was a profound theologian, and he didn't really want to get involved in the politics of the council. So he wanted to go be alone in the wilderness. He had a brother named Gregory of Nazianzus, and he was good friends with Athanasius, who was one of the primary theologians who wrote the Council, the Creed of Nicaea. But this guy, he really was experiential too. So as you were saying, Lucas, you know, he just wasn't about theology. He was very aware of the spiritual journey and believed in it, that each of us need to be on it and grow and seek after God. So, and because knowledge was limited, so even though he had all this theological knowledge, you could see why he was an experiential theologian. He experienced God, and thus he came up with these extraordinary ideas. Some of them are extraordinary about the Trinity, about the oneness, which now physics is just now affirming this idea of particle and wave. That, you know, it's so profound, but we can't go down that rabbit hole. Let's keep going. So any other questions about Gregory of Nyssa? You can see how he began to influence Christianity. Let's go to Evagrius of Ponticus. You can see Evagrius is of a similar vintage in terms of the time frame. Evagrius is a guy who went out into the desert. He became a very significant, you might say, abbot, and he is most famous for developing onto this idea of these threefold stages of the spiritual journey. He called them the practicae, or the active life, the physicae, which is natural contemplation, and the theologica, or which is the contemplation of God. So just to give a little explanation of these things, the practicae, or active life, that Greek word practicae, where we get our word practice from. So we practice the piano, we practice law. So you develop a skill or a craft to be a practitioner of something. So this is about basically your apprenticeship of being a Christian. You are learning the ropes, so to speak. And you discover at this early phase in the spiritual journey that you can't do it on your own. You discover what he called the logikoi, or the deadly thoughts, temptations, passions. And as you work on yourself, as you practice not giving in to temptation, you develop what he called apatheia, which is that you're not moved by the temptation. You see the food, and instead of going and eating it, nothing moves inside. You've become at peace, unperturbable is the word. This is a really wonderful state for human beings to acquire. But he said you can acquire that by practicing this little by little. Then the second part, or the journey, which these can overlap, is he called physicae, or natural contemplation, where we begin, you could say this is the good scientist who looks at the order of things, looks at the trees, looks at the bees, looks at the sky and the ocean, and looks at God's glory and sees the truths of God. Like the psalmist says, the heavens are declaring the glory of God. And you then are lifted up in kind of worship and understanding by way of this natural contemplation of the physical world, nature contemplation. Then the third part is the highest development of a human being, which is called theologica, which is the contemplation of God as the Holy Trinity, as the source of all things and knowledge. And most importantly, this state, or this phase of life, you begin to enter into what he called true prayer, which was a seeing of God, not so much a verbalizing of requests, but a kind of seeing of God, of gazing upon God and God's glory, and just communing with God, which is a kind of heart prayer. And this, again, is a hint of what would come years, centuries later, really, about meditative methods. Hinduism and Buddhism had these meditative methods to begin with. They were not a part of Christianity. They would come later. But here you see a hint of it, that this kind of knowledge of, by way of seeing God inwardly, that leads to true prayer, which for him meant the shedding of all thoughts. The shedding of all thoughts, which is another word for that is meditation. So when we drop down from the mind into the heart, into the body, and he called that last stage of human development on the spiritual journey, theologica. So similar to Gregory's 3 phases of, being enlightened by truth, groping after, being purged, and then entering the divine darkness and seeing God in a new way. Evagrius was the first to begin to write about and articulate the 7 deadly sins. There were 6 at the time, I believe. And he would then die, and his successor is by a fellow by the name of John Cassian. And Cassian wrote 2 big volumes on the ascetic life for the monks, and he really systematized. Evagrius was just a free thinker, but Cassian, his successor, systematized it and left a very specific record of the process by which we deal with these deadly sins and how we progress on the spiritual journey. Again, look at the dates. This is during the Christian Empire. Constantine's Christian empire is taking off. Meanwhile, a group of people from various regions around the Mediterranean world, especially Egypt, Palestine, what is now Turkey, what was then called Cappadocia, were fleeing the cities and going to the deserts to do this threefold journey. And they went to these people like Evagrius and John Cassian, who they viewed as spiritual fathers, and learned these things. Any questions about Evagrius and how he influenced the spiritual journey? More than anyone else, he has very much influenced Thomas Keating's thinking and Thomas Merton's thinking in the modern times in terms of the threefold process. Pseudo-Dionysius would pick this up and re-term the threefold process in the famous terms that we'll get to in a minute. The purgative, the illuminative, and the unitive. The purgative, the illuminative, and the unitive. Those are the 3 phases for Pseudo-Dionysius. But we'll get to him in just a moment. Let's go to St. Augustine. There's a lot to say about St. Augustine. But let me just see, any questions about Evagrius or the monastic influence? I know we're going fast. More than anything, I hope to whet people's awareness of this tradition. It's a living tradition. And, most evangelicals today in the modern period, the fundamentalists, the conservatives, their view of the spiritual journey is pretty much like Pilgrim's Progress. You follow Jesus, and you keep following, you pick up your cross, you go through suffering, and you have faith, and then you die and you go to heaven. And that's pretty much the extent of the spiritual journey for a lot of people in Western Christianity. In Roman Catholicism, the spiritual journey is come to church, take Eucharist, do penance, go to confession, and maybe, just maybe, you won't go to purgatory. But if you go to purgatory, you'll be purged and then you'll go to heaven. And that's pretty much the extent of what people understand on the spiritual journey. But what I hope you're seeing here is that there's a richness to the understandings and the models of the spiritual journey that is much deeper than what most people think is the spiritual journey. All right, let's look at St. Augustine. His Confessions is a famous book. They've turned it into one of the classics of Western civilization. That and the City of God. So you'll come across the Confessions in a lot of college lit classes, world lit classes. And so many people have had exposure to at least that, the Confessions. It's famously remembered as beginning by its first opening paragraph, where he concludes the paragraphs like this: Our hearts are restless until they find rest in Thee, O God. And he is talking about the spiritual journey, that our hearts are restless until they find rest in Thee, O God. And the word rest is very significant. You know, our hearts are restless until they find purpose in You, until they find a calling in You, until they find a salvation in You. He doesn't use any of those words. He uses the word rest, which means the stillness and cessation of activity. It's very contemplative, that what we're really longing for is what Mary discovered, the better part in the Gospel of Luke, when Jesus comes to Martha and she's complaining that Mary's just not doing anything. And he says to Martha, 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 you're worried and concerned about so many things. Just relax. Mary has chosen the better part. So there's this sense of emphasis of the rest, just trust in God. And that was the main theme of St. Augustine's writing, through like a golden thread, faith. It's your faith in what God has done for you. It's a gift. So he was able to emphasize this notion of rest in God. That didn't mean that he didn't have active emphasis of seeking God, but there's that theme. The next thing I want to talk about with St. Augustine is this idea of his autobiography, and it begins, obviously he's telling the story of his life called The Confessions, but it's the first spiritual autobiography in Western civilization, probably human history, perhaps. I mean, it's kind of like Odysseus, you know, the Iliad, but that's being narrated by someone else. So this is an autobiography. It's really the first spiritual autobiography in Western civilization that we're aware of. And so it brings to light the value of reflecting on one's life as a means of grace, as a way of being on the spiritual journey by looking at your life story. Like your story is where God shows itself to you. That each of our lifetimes is the book that we read to discover God. It's so beautiful. Like we don't have to go to the Bible to know God. Read your life. Read your life. And St. Augustine shows us that. It's just awesome. And his humility, his conviction, his open-heartedness, he's so real and honest about himself. It's really the first, AA program of human history. He stands up and says, my name is August, and I'm a sinner. He basically does that. He tells the story of his life. And he was quite the sensuous man, and very powerful man. Probably, North African, hippos in North Africa, a black man, an African man. So one of the most influential theologians in human history was a black man. I think people forget that. So the importance of conversion and beginning the journey and then being on the journey and keeping account of one's life by telling one's stories is a beautiful model to get in touch with God. But the other thing I wanted to share about St. Augustine is he has these prayers throughout his storytelling that are extraordinary, and they are contemplative in nature, and he basically reveals. So he has these, this is from Book of Eternity. Art my God, to thee was what I might see, forth thy beam tremendous, was what I might see, forth thy beam tremendous. The clearly articulating the other aspect, the other aspects, all these spiritual journey was this prayer for all of us. Okay, so this is a little, all these spiritual journey was this prayer for all of us. Okay, so this is a little things. We were soaring high, and we came plenty, waiting for her, that is truth. We for a moment touched on her with the whole effort of our heart, and we sighed, and there we left bound the first fruits of the Spirit, and returned to verbal communication where the spoken word has beginning and end. It's profound. So he's trying to describe a mystical experience that he had where he's seeing, not talking. There you have this sense of which is underneath to this day. You see that no one, which is a famous preaching by the name of, whose right works out there, and he took students in the 1st century, 2nd century. Well, people thought this was actually him, The guy, Pseudo-Dionysius, for centuries people thought this, until modern scholarship showed there's no way these writings were written before the 4th century. This was a pseudonym. This guy lived in the 5th century and the 6th century. And so today we just call him Pseudo-Dionysius. Some people just call him Dennis. So that's the background. This guy may be the most influential theologian on Christian spirituality and our understanding of the spiritual journey and the contemplative dimension, the most influential yet unknown. Even though you all heard of him, some of you heard of him, most Christians have never heard of Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite, this writer. Most people have never read his main books, Mystical Theology, The Divine Names, and The Celestial Hierarchy. Of all those, I would only give any time to reading Mystical Theology, and I would read it. It's profound. Mystical Theology is the shortest of them all. The others are just, in my view, just a mythology, just kind of a worldview that is imaginative but interesting. It's very influenced by Platonism, but not very useful for our understanding of the spiritual journey today. Very hierarchical. Again, you've got to ascend the ladder up to heaven. Dionysius was very concerned and interested in God and our relationship with God, but instead of going the Gnostic path and even the Neoplatonic path, he went a different direction. We return to the one. The distinction between the Neoplatonic one proceeds into multiplicity and participation as a matter of course, but the Dionysian God desires to share itself by love. And this was a very important Christian emphasis, that it wasn't just God was unreachable, but God wants to share itself by loving human beings and revealing itself to others. That God comes down to us like a rope being dropped from heaven. And that's the rungs or the hierarchy, so to speak. He said that all intellectual activity should be left behind. That with the understanding made quiet, or the mind quiet, we can strain toward union with God, who is beyond all being and understanding. Who's beyond all being and understanding. It's a really good theological viewpoint. Karl Barth would reclaim some of this in the mid-20th century. He said, we can't know God. By renouncing the self in all things of the world, it is possible, however, to be drawn upward into the ray of divine darkness that surpasses all existence. And it's very similar to Gregory of Nyssa's perspective of Moses going up. Dionysius then coined 3 stages in the soul's journey to God. They are, as I mentioned, purgation or purification, illumination, and union. And this threefold process of the spiritual journey, based on what Pseudo-Dionysius wrote, became the classic form from therefore onward in Christian history. And you will see it again and again, even to this day, in like Evelyn Underhill, modern writer, Thomas Keating, Thomas Merton, all the way back, to Thomas Aquinas, and before that, Meister Eckhart, Julian of Norwich, etc. A lot of the mystics we're going to consider in the remaining weeks, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, all of them just absorbed this threefold process and stuck with it. Thomas Keating, in our generation, which we'll get to the last Sunday we meet, he updated this from a psychological perspective in a very beautiful way. But I won't go into that now. Just to talk about Dionysius, just one more moment here. This threefold process has kind of like been being played with for a couple hundred years, and now he systematizes it in purification, illumination, and union. Union was the most important of all these stages, and not many people reached it. But you could reach that unitive state in this life. Not just an experience, a unitive experience, which a lot of people have, but he said you could reach the unitive state and remain in that state and never be unmoved. He writes in Mystical Theology this beautiful image of being transformed like a sculpture. Once more, ascending yet higher, he writes, we maintain that it is not soul or mind or endowed with the faculty of imagination, conjecture, reason, or understanding, nor is it any act of reason or understanding, nor can it be described by the reason or perceived by the understanding, since it is not number or order or greatness or littleness, nor is it one, nor is it unity, nor is it Godhead or goodness, nor is it a spirit, as we understand the term, since it is not sonship or fatherhood, nor is it any other thing such as I or any other being can have knowledge of. It's a radical unknowing, a radical stripping away of all language of what God is. You can't describe God, you can't know God. It's pure darkness and pure faith. And yet illumination can happen, and oneness with this unknown reality can happen, who transcends all things and all people and all reality, beyond this dimension. This darkness of unknowing is the stage of union, and it's in this darkness, with the stilling of the rational mind, one can be united to the unknowable God, and it changes a person. So this unknowing, which is beyond comprehension, beyond words, is what I would call the silence of the contemplative tradition. And so what we see is it takes another 1,500 years for the modern era to really give psychological nuance to what he's trying to describe philosophically and theologically. At a practical level, what he's really describing is the experience of Advaita, the experience of Shavasana in yoga, the experience of deep contemplation and stillness that many people have when they go on retreats and they sit in the silence and the stillness. And he didn't have a practice, really. He didn't have a meditative practice to kind of help explain the experience. He's just thinking about the experience. And it's much more speculative. This is what I would call speculative theology, almost like speculative physics. Like, no one's ever seen a black hole, really. We just hypothesize that it's there. It's speculative cosmology. This is speculative theology. And now, today, in our understanding of the spiritual journey from a psychological perspective, we have much more clarity on what he's talking about. And we'll get to that in the next weeks as we cover some of the more modern mystics. Any comments or questions? We've covered a lot of territory. Thank you for listening and being here. There's no unhelpful question. Every question's helpful.
This is somewhat silly, but a Bob Dylan song about St. Augustine. Have you listened?
No, I don't know that song. A Bob Dylan song about St. Augustine.
Yeah. I saw St. Augustine alive and willing, really well.
Huh.
You know, I just wonder, I think it's been very influential in a lot of ways, but I want to see, and I think people, I remember when Bob Dylan first came out, because I was young, I was in law school, I guess. Anyway, and I said, he's a great American poet. And I got lots of criticism for calling him a great American poet. But he did win the Nobel Prize for
Yes.
being a great American poet. And I just always have been baffled by trying to follow, you know what I'm talking about. Day and so on, alive and living.
What's the name of the song?
St. Augustine.
Oh, we'll look that up.
Yeah, I think it is.
Well, thank you for that. So next week, Sunday. Oh, yeah.
That's why more people probably think of St. Augustine because of that song. In the 20th and 21st century, they didn't have a reason, but I've never, it's baffling, and he needs it to be baffling. He needs to be, I just think it's
His arm and a coat of solid gold.
All right, well, that's a great. I saw St. Augustine. Great. Okay, next week we're going to look at St. Francis and Meister Eckhart. So if you're interested, we're getting more in the modern era. Thank you all for being here. Yeah.